that right, Israel has to be exalted, vindicated, uplifted, as all of their enemies are leveled and taken down. So it won't do to preach to Israel about a coming day of peace when one of their enemies stands somewhat opposing them. No, if that's going to happen, God's going to have to picture them as being leveled. In order to picture them as being the enemies are going to have to be leveled. So in Isaiah chapter 19, we're in the context of a judgment upon Egypt. Now this is significant for a couple of reasons, but the main reason here is because we're going to look at Egypt in Isaiah chapter 22 here in just a moment. That's going to resurface. So the continent of Africa is down here. Egypt, of course, has the Nile River out this way. Egypt is the south. In the current oracle, Egypt is pictured. Remember, we don't have to find all of these details historically fulfilled in order for us to get the big picture. That's what Isaiah is going for. If we were to leave one word to speak about this chapter, he is presenting judgment upon Egypt. So in Isaiah chapter 19 and verse 16, it's in that day when Egypt is judged, that shall be scared like unto women. It says in 17 that remember, Judah is the smallest people in the world. That's why God chose them. He chose Judah and Israel because they were the smallest people. And so if He can bring the smallest nation and raise them to this height of power, that shows His power. But if He had used the boss, that really doesn't say a whole lot for God, does it? So He chooses Judah and Israel, makes a covenant with them, and it's saying this. Look at this in 19:17 again. The small nation, Judah, all guys are going to win. Then it says in 18, it's in that day when Judah is victorious, when God is uplifted, that I, in the land of Egypt, will speak the language of Canaan. And Charles read for us using New American Standard Bible. Okay, he's got a different Bible this week. Anyway, his version last week read it this way: the city of the sun. And that's because of a textual variant. And like I said last week, if you've got a question about what that is, ask me after, and I'll tell you what a textual variant is. But nonetheless, the city of destruction, how it's written in the King version, or it's translated as maybe that's what the prophet's going for, is the city of Hierapolis, as it's called in the Greek Old Testament. Nonetheless, the point is this: we don't need to look for 5 specific cities. The prophet just grabs a hold of a random number and says a host of Egypt's capital cities will be speaking the language of the Jews. This is all very visionary. This doesn't have to be literally fulfilled. But he's picturing a day when Judah is on top and Egypt is the servant. And so it says in 19, in that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar. That's a strange word in the text. It's the word mazabah, and it's at the border thereof to the Lord. Anybody know what it's called? Washington, know what that is called? Obelisk. Yeah. You got it. You got it, Norman. Something like this. You know, my artwork obviously is not the best, but it has this kind of structure. That's what we're for. It's a monument. It's an altar. It's a shrine that's built. And look at this. Look at this. There's a passage in Deuteronomy 16, I think it is. Deuteronomy 16, where God gives them. Look at 16:16, Deuteronomy. This is back under the Jewish law. And it says in 16:16, 3 times in a year, your males will appear before the Lord thy God in the place which He shall choose. It's talking about Jerusalem. The Jews were supposed to go to Jerusalem. And watch what it says in 16:21. Do not plant thee a grove of any trees. You might remember the word grove. That's an idol. Don't make an idol to the Lord unto the thy God. And then it says, don't set up any word. Don't make this the Lord, which the Lord thy God hated. Isaiah 19. It's in this day that the Egyptians set up the very kind of thing that the Torah forbade. What's going on? I don't think the prophet necessarily is saying that they're violating the Torah. Remember, they're heathens. They're not even amenable to the Torah. So what's going on? The Egyptians are not God-fearers. They don't worship Jehovah. But in this visionary scene, in order to picture them as being converted to Judaism, they set up an altar or a shrine or an obelisk to the Lord thy God, pleasing Him in the best way they know how. Remember, they don't have the Pentateuch. And so it's all in the vision. All that God's presenting, all that Isaiah is presenting, is a day when Egypt idealistically comes and converts to God. It doesn't necessarily have to be literal. It's a forced recognition. When God judges Egypt, now He forces them to be subservient to His people. In 20, it will be for a sign, for a witness, this obelisk will, unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. I'm going to skip through some of this. In verse 21, the Lord will be known to Egypt. Whoa, when does this ever happen? It doesn't. It doesn't. And then it says this, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day. They're going to do sacrifice and oblation. This has never happened. Is the prophet wrong? No, he's not wrong. He's speaking idealistically. He's not speaking literally at all. And so in then 23, look at this. In that day, there will be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptian shall serve with the Assyrians. Watch 24 and 25, and hopefully I'll make some of this make sense. In 24, in that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria. So there are three different units: Assyria, Egypt, and Israel. And then it says in 25, the Lord will bless, saying, blessed be Egypt, and He calls these heathens, the Egyptians, His people. And then He says regarding Assyria, that nation, Assyria, is the work of His hands, and then He calls Israel His inheritance. What's going on? None of this is literally historically fulfilled, nor is that the intention of the prophet. But somebody grab Isaiah 2:2 for us. Somebody grab Isaiah 2 and verse 2 and read that if you don't mind. In this vision in Isaiah chapter 2, Israel is pictured idealistically as being the boss. In fact, so much so that Israel is pictured as the center of the world's religion. The prophet is speaking of a day coming. He doesn't know when it is, but he is speaking of a day when God comes to the rescue of His people and elevates Jerusalem above the nations. That's the same kind of thing that's being talked about in Isaiah 19. And he says there's going to be a highway out of Egypt, and it runs all the way up to Assyria. And there's going to be the same highway that runs all the way from Assyria down to right there in the midst of all. Esther chapter 8, I think it's verse 7. This is after all the captivity passes, the exile's done. Somebody grab Esther 8 and verse 17 for us, and listen to what happens after the captivity. Esther 8, those small books, they're small. Whoever's got it, go ahead. Esther 8, 7. People of the land became Jews. They prospered. They said, oh, we see that things are going good for your nation. We want to partake. We want to be part. Look at this. Look at 1 Kings chapter 4. This is after Solomon has just taken the throne. 1 Kings chapter 4. Verse 34. Look at what the people do here. I'll just verse 4:34. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth. What has happened is all the people of the land want to go to Jerusalem because that's where God's blessings are being had. Other passages like Joshua chapter 2, Isaiah 60, Isaiah 62. We'll get there, especially in our study. Go back to Isaiah 16. What's happening in this is highly idealistic. Not literal. Egypt is pictured as one of Egypt, along with Assyria, wanting to attach themselves to God's people because that's where the are. There's a day coming when opens up and we haven't. It was in the year that Tartan is not a. You'll see the same word occur in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 17, where the Tartan comes to Hezekiah's court, and he starts to make some kind of declaration or decree. But he's just a field marshal. He's the second in command. And so the Tartan, or Tartan just without the definite article as he's referred to here, comes unto Ashdod when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him and fought against Ashdod and took Ashdod, being the city there. This is probably around the year 711 BC. Now, Sargon the king reigned from 722 to 705 BC. And there have been archaeological finds all over the place over in the ancient Near East. And there are archaeological finds where he records, he makes boasts against Jerusalem and against Judah. And he makes these boasts saying, aha, I've captured, I've taken, I've done this, I'm so great, I'm so wonderful. And of course I'm paraphrasing all that. But there have been archaeological finds that validate what the Bible has to say on the matter. This is remarkable. Well, nonetheless, it's about the year 711 BC that it was at this time, this is interesting. Look at verse 2. That Isaiah, the son of Amoz, receives this oracle from God. And look at what God tells him in verse 2. Go and loose the sackcloth from off thy loin, and put off thy shoe from thy foot. Somebody help us out. What is sackcloth? That's pretty good. Yes. So you wear it when you're either happy or sad. Sad. It's the clothing you put on when you go to a funeral. You wear black. Well, sackcloth in this day was, like Marcel was saying, a rugged, rough kind of apparel, almost like a burlap. And they would put this on along with ashes in order to demonstrate sorrow, pity. And so in 20 verse 2, Isaiah takes this off. It's very possible, I would say probable, that he has on some. What it says in verse 2, he did so walking naked and barefoot. No sandals, no burlap. He's pictured among the people as being quote-unquote naked with his undergarments on. But all of this sends a big message to the people of Israel. What is it? The nation. The nation is in this kind of sorrowful state. So bad that we're not even wearing the clothing you wear to a funeral. We're wearing even less than that. And he says in verse 3, the Lord said, like as my servant Isaiah has walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia, in that same way the king of Assyria now will take away the Egyptians. They'll take them as prisoners. The Ethiopians will be captives, the young, the old, the naked, the barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered to the shame of Egypt. I forget what I typed in the Google search. Maybe just Sargon or something like that. But You can look at some of these archaeological finds, and even in the etchings on the archaeological finds, do this in your own time, or now if you're really concerned. But pull out your phone, get on Google, and type in Sargon archaeological finds or something like that. And you can actually see the pictures where they have guys lined up somewhat like this, walking in the inscription, the etching on the stone, and you can see that they've got them naked even in the archaeological finds. This was a sign, this was a symbol of extreme mockery. And the Assyrians did that sort of thing not only to the Egyptians, but also to the Jews. And so in 20 verse 5 it says, "They shall be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, their expectation, and of Egypt, their glory." And then it says in verse 6, "The inhabitant of this isle shall say, in that day," when this happens idealistically, "Behold, such is our expectation, whither we flee for help to be delivered from the king of Assyria, and how shall we escape?" Okay, let me give you a brief summary. I know that was quick. Let me give you a brief summary of why Isaiah 20 was written, or why it was given as an... It would seem to me that Isaiah shows up. He goes to the king. That's what it says in verse 2. Go and do this. Where's he doing it? Obviously out in the streets of Jerusalem. And he's supposed to go and do this amongst Hezekiah and amongst the courtiers and amongst all of the people as a symbol that Assyria is going to invade. Isaiah is trying to persuade Hezekiah not to trust him. Based on our reading of Isaiah 26, that Isaiah succeeds. Hezekiah turns back to God and puts his trust in God, and therefore Israel is spared from Sargon in 711 BC. Sadly, it's not always going to be that way. So, the people are spared. Hezekiah listens to Isaiah. So far, things are successful. Okay, any questions at this point before? Yes, Nyoka. That's a tricky question. Here's why. It is in the vision. It is. But sometimes in the vision, God also gives him a directive and tells him to go perform this in actuality. So some of it's literal, some of it's in the vision. And that's sometimes tough to discern which is which. But you are correct. In Isaiah 1:1, he says that his oracles form what is called the vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz. So, it's tricky. Yes, that's what I was talking about, the archaeological finds, yeah. Yeah. Definitely, yes. Anything else? Maybe that helps, maybe not. I don't know. Ethiopia is going to be, down here towards Egypt. Okay. 21 then is what it's called as 21:1, the burden of the desert of the sea. Tough to say, but it seems very clear that he's referencing Merodach-Baladan, Babylon. I'm not going to read all of this, but look at 21 and verse 2. He explicitly calls the Medians to enact the judgment. We're well acquainted with the Old Testament history. That happened. It says in verse 5. This is interesting, and it reminds us a lot of Daniel chapter 5. You might remember where Belshazzar throws this party, drunken feast and idolatrous, and he brings in the women, and they're all unclothed. But in Isaiah 21:5 it says, "Prepare the table, watch in the watchtower, eat, drink, arise, ye princes, and anoint the shield." Basically, which is a taunt or a mockery, where God is even saying through Isaiah to the Babylonians, go ahead and have your feast. Judgment's coming in. And then, of course, you've got this explicit reference in 21:9 where he answers, "Babylon is fallen, which, of course, is later capitalized upon in other passages, especially the book of Revelation. But then in verse 10, he calls the judgment upon Babylon a threshing, which is the idea that the scythe is taken to the wheat or to the corn, and then, of course, it's either shucked or peeled or however. And it says, "In the corn of my floor." Then verse 11, the burden of Dumah. And once again, we have this other judgment that's coming in upon this land. It's upon Edom. Dumah is Edom. Judgment is pronounced upon them in 11 and 12. And then in verses 13 through 17, we have a third judgment in this chapter, and it's upon Arabia. And Arabia is supposed to be judged as well. I'm trying to get through some of this judgment language. He's basically restating the same thing in different wording, but it's about a different nation, and he's just simply saying all of the heathen that surround Jerusalem will be humbled as Jerusalem is exalted and uplifted. 22 then, you've got the burden of the valley of vision. Now this is good because we've got 14 verses at the start of the chapter that are somewhat... But in 25, we get into a little bit of narrative. In 22:1, he calls it the burden of the valley of vision. It's upon Jerusalem. Jerusalem is now receiving judgment even. And this is probably the campaign 701 BC. But why does this happen? Look at verse 8. By the way, it says in the King James, "He discovered the covering of Judah." Anybody have a different translation there? He removed. Yeah, discovered was the usage of the word in the 1611 edition of the King James Version. But basically what we're going for there is uncovered or removed. So he removes covering, he removes the veil or the clothing, and makes them naked, is the idea of the passage, verse 8. And it says in verse 11, why did he do this? Why did he bring judgment? Because you've not looked unto the maker thereof. You didn't have respect unto him that had fashioned it long ago. Every judgment that ever comes upon a person or a nation, whatever, is always because somebody got too high-minded and wanted to play God. Think about how that affects you and me. If God brought down Babylon or Arabia or Edom or these other nations back then because they wanted to play God and they wanted to play themselves, what do you think that means to us and to our nations in the present day? It means don't play God. It means don't try to be who you're really not, nor try to make claims to divinity when you're not. And then, of course, make this stupid claim, 22:13. They say, "Oh, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die." That's 22 verse 13. B. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. Oh, judgment's moving in? Don't worry about it. We're going to die tomorrow? Let's party. Not really the most wise thing to suggest. And so if judgment is moving on, even if we don't know about it, we ought to be prepared for such a thing. Okay, verse 14, God says, "This iniquity will not be purged from you until you die." Oh my, that's harsh. But what God is saying is until you're purged of your sin, judgment's going to be moving in. Okay, anything on 22:1 through 14? That's a judgment upon Jerusalem, and that's God's people. And then, in association with that, you've got different. Now, this section is fun, probably not the best word, but that's what we'll go with. But it's upon Shebna. Now, Jerusalem is situated here, and this is where the judgment's pronounced. Judah. Now, who's the king? Remind me if you know. Hezekiah. Hezekiah is our king. And Hezekiah is righteous, but he's also wishy-washy. He tries to do good, 2 Kings 18 says, but he ends up dying. And where he is today, But nonetheless, in 2 Kings 18, he was a decent king at this time. And he has a second in command, verse 15 says. It calls him, as the King James has it, the treasurer. And his right-hand man is Shebna. Read it with me in verse 15. Thus saith the Lord God of hosts, go get thee unto this treasurer. There's a question about the translation there. I'll come back to that here in a moment. Even unto Shebna, the one who is over the house, and ask him, what do you have here? Who do you have here? And what about this sepulchre that you have? And you're hewing it out as a sepulchre on high, and you're graving an image, a habitation for yourself in this rock? We'll come back to all of this, of course. But then in verse 17, the declaration is to be made from Isaiah to Shebna, the second in command. The Lord is going to carry you away, verse 17, with a mighty captivity, thoroughly cover thee. He will violently turn and toss thee like a, here's another weird word, ball. Anybody have anything else there? Verse 18? Probably not. That's kind of the most common translation. Into a large country, and there thou shalt die. And there the chariots of thy glory shall be the shame of thy Lord's house. And in verse 19, the declaration is made from Isaiah to Shebna, I will drive thee from thy station, and from thy state shall he, speaking of God, pull thee down. Okay, what's going on? It's interesting that down here in Egypt, you've got this city that had archaeological finds come about in the last couple of years. And what was uncovered was they had mountains. And then in the mountains, you had some kind of like a tomb-like structure that was found. But behind that, they had like a mortuary. And back here, of course, you could go back in, and you can look some of this up on Google also. I read Christopher B. Hayes, and he explains all of this and has some pictures to go along with it. Fascinating stuff. But nonetheless, they had those obelisks. And why am I bringing all of this? The word that is used, King James, as treasurer, in 22 verse 15, actually means mortuary or stela. Leaving the impression, not necessarily that it's talking about Shebna's office, that he's a treasurer, but instead God is telling Isaiah the prophet, go and get you to Shebna at the mortuary, at the tomb. Go to the tomb. Which is very fitting. Now read the text. In mind that he is probably fashioning a tomb after the style of the Egyptians that has the obelisk. It's dedicated only to him and to his name. And remarkably, this tomb perhaps has been uncovered over in the city of Jerusalem at the foot of the Mount of Olives, suggesting that perhaps it was the tomb of Shebna. What's happened? Look at 22:15 again. God tells Isaiah, go preach to Shebna at the tomb. He's the one that's the second in command over the house of David, over the house of Hezekiah. And tell him, ask him, why do you have this tomb? Why have you dedicated it only to yourself and to your name? Look at verse 16 again. You've engraven an habitation, a tomb, for yourself in a rock. So what Isaiah is supposed to show up, talk to Shebna, and inquire about this tomb. Why, while judgment is incoming upon Jerusalem, you've got the armies out here around the city, why are you concerning yourself with the building of a tomb in the side of the cliff? Two problems with that. The first one, he's building a tomb, it would appear, after the style of the Egyptians, based on the word in 22:15, stela, mortuary stela. And then the second problem is he's only concerned about himself, as verse 16 explicitly notes. He's building this tomb only for himself, not for a host of people, as it would have been customary within the city of Jerusalem. Then in verse 17, Isaiah tells him, you want a tomb? You're preparing for death? Well, let me go ahead and make it clear to you, Shebna. The Lord is going to carry you away with a mighty captivity, And you'll get your burial. You'll be covered up. And then the word ball is interesting because that's kind of a poor translation. The word ball maybe should be translated something like your head wrappings. And you can picture something like that of a mummy, where Isaiah preaches now to Shebna and says, you will be buried, verse 17, and now says in verse 18, and then you'll see God turning you like a ball or like a head covering, where He rolls you out. The head rolls out of the tomb. He's beheaded. You're thrown into a large country, which is remarkable. Maybe it's Assyria, but there's a linguistic parallel perhaps to the world. And maybe Isaiah is saying, you'll go without a burial. You'll go wandering in the underworld without God. And then says this, and there you will die. There the chariots of thy glory will be the shame of thy Lord's house. And here's the ultimate conclusion. You've been the right-hand man, verse 19. You've been the right-hand man of Hezekiah. But God's going to see to it, because of your own agenda, that He pulls you down and elevates another. Now look at who He puts in His place. Shebna is removed, apparently. We have no historical record, but this is the oracle that's supposed to be preached to him. And then it says in 22, and verse 20, in that day that I'll call my servant Eliakim, the son of... So Shebna, the man with the agenda, is going to be thrown down, and God's going to put somebody else who does the right thing in his place. His name is Eliakim. Somebody get for us 36, Isaiah 36, verse 3, and look at what happens later on in our text. Isaiah 36, verse 3. A little bit later on in Isaiah's text, Shebna has already been removed, and Elijah over them. Look at 37:2. I'll read this one. The king of Assyria sent Rabshakeh, that's 36. 37:2. He sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, who was obviously now even lower than Eliakim, now set him up, and the elders of the priests covered with sackcloth, Isaiah the prophet. A little bit later on, Eliakim is second in command, and Shebna has been deposed. Go back to Isaiah 22 then and watch what happens. Let's see if there are some of these remarkable parallels in our passage. Whoever has it, if you don't mind reading 21 through 23 for us. Isaiah 2, 1 through 23. Okay. Look at these terms that I've got on the board that are demonstrated about Eliakim. You've got the term, the government of the house of David is going to be placed upon him. Verse 22, it's stated that it's going to be placed upon his shoulder. In 21, it calls father, which is not necessarily always divinity, but it's text. It's in Genesis and a couple of the other Old Testament texts. In 23, it says the throne of David is somehow in association with this. And then, of course, David by name in verse 22. Turn back to Isaiah chapter 9. This is a passage we've already covered. But in Isaiah 9, we had this remark about the child that was to be born. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, and then also verse 7. And look at some of the parallels that occur. Whoever has it, read Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 for us if you don't mind. Okay. Does anybody remember who we identified this child ultimately as when we studied Isaiah 9, 6, and 7? The Messiah. It's interesting how we see all of these terms, the government, the shoulder, him being a father, the throne, all of somehow in association with Eliakim, this son of Hilkiah the priest. What do I think is going on? I think this is God's way of saying to the Jews, you've got a Messiah, a messianic figure, a Judean heir that's coming. And to demonstrate that as some kind of model or prototype, we see Eliakim, the worthy one, take over from Shebna, who is the unworthy one. And it stands as a model to the Jews that there's a day coming where the Messiah, the worthy one, is going to take over from that unworthy line of physical kings. Maybe we're reading too much into that, but then of course you've got some New Testament references that explicitly claim this kind of thing. So take a look at the passage with me again, Isaiah 22, where it says then in verse 21, he, Eliakim, will be a father, as it's used in Genesis 45, 8, or 2 Kings 5:13 also. He'll be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Verse 22, and the key, and there is record in Judges 3:25. We won't read it for sake of time, but if you're taking notes, make note of Judges 3:25, where there was a large wooden key that they would have to unlock the gates or something like that. Or taken from Shebna, the unworthy one, and given to Eliakim. Later in the book of Revelation, what does Christ tell them? He says, I hold the key of David, that sort of thing. This is, of course, an allusion or an echo back to Isaiah 22, where he's saying, I'm the worthy heir over the house of David. So it's a very cryptic response, but it's a remark where he's saying, I'm the Davidic heir, I'm the Davidic Messiah. You've been waiting for one? I'm here. That's what he's saying. And then in Isaiah 22, he'll fasten him, Eliakim, as a nail in a sure place, and he shall be for a glorious throne to his father's house. Verse 24, they'll hang upon him all the glory of his father's house, speaking of David as his ultimate father way back yonder. And then it says in verse 25, it's in that day when Eliakim is set up and Shebna is opposed, it's in that day that the Lord of hosts makes the declaration that the nail will be fastened in the sure place, and that will actually be removed, speaking of Shebna, and he'll be cut down and will fail, and the burden that was upon it shall be cut off, for the Lord has spoken it. Why is this delivered in this section of oracles upon nations? It speaks about a coming day where God is going to set Jerusalem where they belong with the right kind of ruler, and he's going to remove even out of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel the wicked rulers who have oppressed them. People like Ahab, or people like Ahaz, or some of these other wicked kings. A day is coming, is what God's saying, when you're going to have the right kind of king, and all of those wicked ones who have oppressed you will be removed. Any questions on 22 before we get into 23? Okay. 23 then. How much time do we have, incidentally? 5 minutes. Okay, we'll get through 23 quickly. And we'll stop there. 24 through 27 forms another unit. We don't want to get into that yet. In 23:1, it says the burden of Tyre. Tyre is, of course, I think in verse 2, and then also verse 6. the inhabitants of the isles. Anybody know the history regarding Tyre and Sidon? Okay. No, not shipwreck. Got several oracles in your old. My placement of this is rough, you understand. But Tyre and Sidon were situated here off the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. There were several oracles. Zechariah 9, the book of Jeremiah has a couple of oracles against Tyre. Ezekiel presents one in Ezekiel 28. Yeah, 28 is the oracle against Tyre. Anyway, Tyre was this city, and it was long known for commercial. They oppressed the Jews. They weren't friends to the Jews. They were wicked people. And so it was expected by the proclamation of the prophets that they would one day be leveled. This happened multiple times. And several secular historians, what happened is Nebuchadnezzar starts a 13-year siege against the thing. Well, Nebuchadnezzar ultimately is winning. So what they do is they build a city out on what they also had as an island. They had an island out to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And so the whole city loses the battle to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and they flee to their island. This fulfills certain prophecies to a degree when it prophesies that Nebuchadnezzar would come and level the thing. It's talking about that inland part. About 200 years later, Alexander the Great begins his campaign up here from Greece, south. And one of the first places he comes to, he goes to Hamath, he goes to Damascus, he comes down the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. Built a causeway out into the middle of the sea using the stones that were left behind from the desolation wrought by Nebuchadnezzar. Alexander, being the great military leader that he is, goes out there and conquers the city about 333 BC, roughly. Fulfilling certain of the prophecies like Zechariah 9, it would seem. 9, 1 through 8. Yes, Clyde. Yes. Yes. Yeah, in Matthew 10, Matthew 11. Yeah. Anything else? No, they were not. No, these would have been heathen cities. The 6 cities of refuge would have been more in river dividing them. Anything else? Yes, they were. Yeah, Tyre and Sidon were Phoenician cities. Okay. In 23:1, then you've got the burden of Tyre. In spite of the historical background I just gave you, I tend to think that it's even further back with Assyria being the oppressor. And Assyria is going to be the one who's going to bring this judgment in upon Tyre. I'm just going to pick at a couple of these things. Look at verse 9. The Lord of hosts did this. Oh, sure, Assyria was the vehicle or the medium. God did it. God's the one behind all of this. He rules, and He's the boss. He's going to see to it that the wicked nations fall and the righteous ones are upheld. Verse 11, He stretched out His hand over the sea. The Lord has given the commandment against the merchant city. There you have it. It's big in commercialism. Verse 13, behold the land of the Chaldeans. This is a tricky passage, especially in the original language. Behold the land of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. And then it says this people, the Babylonians, did not exist. They were not the boss until the Assyrian founded it for them that dwell in the wilderness. They set up the towers thereof, they raised up the palaces thereof, and he brought it to ruin. I think what's going on is this. Assyria destroyed Babylon at some point there in Sennacherib or Sargon's invasion, and they had been leveled. A couple hundred years later, Babylon rises up and comes to their big power. But I think what's going on in 13 is that God is saying, look at the land of Babylon. Where are they? Oh, Assyria beat them too? Yeah, Assyria is going to do the same kind of thing to Tyre. I think that's what he's going for. And then in verse 15, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years. probably just a reference back to the common lifespan of man, just demonstrating they're going to receive their full end for 70 years, a full lifespan. They're going to be forgotten. And then in verse 18, we'll pick up there. I need to make a remark about 17 and 18 next week. Thank you very much for your kind attention. We'll pick up in 23, 17, and 18 next week.